mostly his ideas that came up with the idea for how this would be structured. We really did want to devise something that would truly be a blessing to the teacher participants who signed up for it. And in spite of whatever strictures the Department of Education was trying to impose on us, we wanted these seminars to be a place where the free exchange of ideas could really take place, and people could have the ability to read these crucial, important primary documents, and have the ability to of course, to learn from some brilliant minds, but also to really to be able to say what they thought about them. And that really does kind of symbolize what we are trying to really bring back at the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. Public higher education is at a point where that kind of learning, where you're sitting in a seminar, where you're across the table from people who may not share your ideas, and you have the opportunity to really just dig into some brilliant text, like the Federalist Papers or something else, and talk about it. That's what we wanted to do here. We love that style of learning. We want to share it with you, and we hope that you'll be able to share it with your students, and of course with one another. If there's two things that I could ask of you as you depart from this week, it's to go back and talk to your colleagues at your schools, and assuming that you liked your experience here, to talk about what a great experience you had, and to encourage them to apply for our programs that we're going to be doing with the K through 12 grant in the future. But not only that, to talk to your students about the center, and this is a kind of learning that is sort of falling out of favor in today's world in higher education, and especially in public higher education. And I think probably most of you know, being in that world and just being in American society, that we really have a problem on our hands, and that's that we've just kind of forgotten how to talk to each other. And that is such a tragedy. And that's what we're trying to counteract with the way we teach at the center, the kinds of faculty members that we want to work with us, those who value the ability to sit across the table from someone and disagree without becoming disagreeable, to value the kind of discussion where the only recognized authority in the room is not your favorite philosopher or your favorite religious text, but the authority of reason itself. Dr. Pullen has left the room, so for those of us who still value reason, we're gonna put an emphasis on that. So anyway, so please go tell your students that there's something new, and there's something very exciting going on at Cleveland State University, and maybe a kind of university that they never would have thought to have had a program like this, but we have it now, and it's going to be great, and we're just at the beginning of it. But we plan to have a major, a minor, a certificate program, and really to be a great blessing to the people of Northeastern Ohio who really deserve it. So anyway, with that said, I am now delighted to introduce to you our speaker for this afternoon, our keynote speaker, Professor Charles Kesler, one of the nation's leading scholars of the American founding and constitutional government. Professor Kesler earned his PhD in government from Harvard University, and he serves on the faculty of Claremont McKenna College and Claremont Graduate University. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Saving the Revolution, the Federalist Papers, and the American Founding. And he is also the editor of the prestigious Claremont Review of Books. His scholarship, leadership, and deep understanding of America's founding principles make him an outstanding resource for our program. So please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Kesler.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure. It's a great honor. I'm speaking, of course, of the fact that we have our first American trillionaire now. And who could be happier about that than Americans sitting in this room, I guess? I don't know. I'm not sure that's true, but it's a kind of quandary that Americans often find themselves in this very inventive, productive, and ambitious country. What I wanted to talk about today is not Elon Musk, even though he's maybe interesting, but rather the Declaration of Independence. And to talk about something beyond which there is hardly anything more American, one might say, than this document. But what I want to talk about is not so much the internal argument of the Declaration or the wording of the Declaration or the process by which it was written, about which you all know something, and there's a lot still to be discovered about that process. Actually, we don't know everything about it. But really to talk about the role of the Declaration of Independence in American history and in American politics. Because here at a forum for civic education, one of the first things you have to realize is that civic education has been going on in the United States ever since the beginning, ever since the Declaration of Independence was printed up as a broadsheet and distributed across the country and printed again in newspapers and of course all sorts of magazines and things. But that for all of the almost 250 years that we're about to celebrate, the Declaration has also been controversial, and it has been in many ways at the heart of our political disagreements with each other. And so civic education, even though it is a time-honored American activity, has always been difficult. It has always veered towards the partisan. It has always been tough. It's a tough business, civic education. It's not as easy as coming to nonpartisan conclusions about American politics. American politics is eminently partisan, always has been, always will be, probably. And so we have to, when we think as citizens, we can't think entirely outside of politics, or we can't disdain politics. There are a lot of things that we do disagree about in this country. We did have, as you know, a very bloody civil war. That wasn't supposed to happen. And in many ways the theory of the country, its federalism, its the large republic argument, the various ways in which we tried to diffuse majority faction in the country and to diffuse extra political conflict in the country, all of those mechanisms worked until they didn't work. And suddenly the Constitution was in crisis. And we held an election in 1860, but we did not, the country as a whole did not honor the winner of that election. So many of the controversies that in the age of Trump we are well aware of about elections and the purity of elections and so forth are not new in American politics. They've been worse even than in our current political environment. Somehow Americans have managed to get through, but only at the cost of a civil war and many other episodes of serious political controversy along the way. And some of those I wanted to say something about today. I can't talk about all of them, needless to say. But we are about to celebrate the semi-quincentennial. That's a hard word to say. It's a Latinate word. It's not, I think, a word that anyone who spoke Latin ever said or ever used. It's one of those Latinate words that isn't really Latin. You know, and what it means, of course, is halfway to 500. So it's actually a very optimistic term, semi-quincentennial. You know, not that many republics make it to 500. The Roman is the most famous example. One could say maybe the Venetian Republic, but nobody knows about the Venetian Republic anymore. That's what usually happens if you make it a long enough time, you fade away. But in the case of Rome, they did last almost 500 years before, of course, they became an empire and the Republic was destroyed politically, and many of the republicans in Rome were destroyed as well in the civil wars, which lasted, you may recall, almost 100 years. It was not a short 4-year civil war like the United States had. It was a period of great political instability and bloodshed that went on for a very long time. And no one was clear about how to get out of it. And they found a way, but they did not, it was not a way that could be repeated very often. And so its success had more to do with continued, well, it had more to do with winning their wars than with bringing peace at home by some external process that they could rinse and repeat with in the next 1,000 years of Roman history. So to call this the semi-quincentennial, meaning we're 250 years on the way, we're halfway to 500 years, is optimistic. But it's not the most optimistic term for this anniversary we're about to celebrate. My friend Jeff Anderson and a few other people insist on calling this the quarter millennial, which is really optimistic. Not many political structures of any sort last 1,000 years. And according to the boast in this term, we are, a fourth of the way to having a 100-year, or rather 1,000-year republic. Well, I don't know. I think that's it's possible. I don't think it's probable, but we'll see. One of the melancholy truths about politics is that nothing human lasts forever, and no regime, no government structure, no form of government lasts forever. And so the decline of political structures is just as much an important part of political science and history as the creation of governmental structures. So the founding is, of course, the beginning of one's study of America and of American politics, but it's not the end of that study. One also has to raise the question, what happened to the regime that the founders founded? What happened to America? How has it changed, if it has changed in important ways? And in what ways is that change healthy or unhealthy? Because change itself is, of course, opaque. You can have positive change or negative change. Calling it growth, and boasting that, well, our change has all been good because we've grown with it, is probably not very shrewd either, because growth can be healthy or unhealthy. Cancer is a form of growth, but cancer is unhealthy. You have to be able to distinguish forms of growth that conduce to the health of the organism and forms of growth, runaway growth, rapid growth in many cases, that conduce to the death of the organism. That's part of political science as it is part of medical science. And the founders, when they were preparing themselves to be founders, when Madison was reviewing the history of ancient republics, let's say, were just as concerned, maybe more concerned, with the signs of decline in ancient history as the signs of health. They wanted to see what went wrong, what had gone wrong in the history of Republican government, because it was very likely to go wrong again. And all that we could do to try to prevent that, we should do. And we tried to do, of course, in various ways with various amounts of success. So let me begin where one usually begins, I suppose, in talking about the Declaration of Independence, and that's with Abraham Lincoln. On his way from Springfield to his inauguration in Washington, D.C. in 1861, Abraham Lincoln paused for a series of impromptu speeches along the way, including a very famous one at Independence Hall in Philadelphia on February the 22nd, 1861. He said there, "I am filled with deep emotion at finding myself standing here in the place where were collected together the wisdom, the patriotism, the devotion to principle, from which sprang the institutions under which we live." He seemed to be referring to the Constitution, whose authority was being challenged by the southern states that had already seceded long before Lincoln got to Washington or took the oath of office as president. He continued in Independence Hall, "I can say that all the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, as far as I've been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall." All his political sentiments came from Independence Hall. That leaves, of course, one very pregnant question. Is he talking about 1776 and the writing of the Declaration of Independence? Or is he talking about 1787 and the writing of the Constitution? Both happened in Independence Hall, separated by a number of years. Both he could be talking about, but which is he talking about? He gives the impression to his listeners that he's talking about institutions in the most basic sense of the term, of the old Latin institutio, which is a synonym for education. He's talking about the education of American hearts and minds that issued from Independence Hall. But while seeming to speak of the Declaration, of the Constitution throughout, Lincoln had all along had in mind the Declaration of Independence, the most fundamental of American institutions and sources of education, because in the next climactic sentence he specifies, "I have never had a feeling politically," he said, "that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So he's not meaning to disregard the Constitution, but he's saying deeper even than the Constitution in the formation of hearts and minds in America is somehow the Declaration of Independence. One could say almost the same thing about American democracy itself, that all of its political feelings somehow spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence. Ordinary Americans, even today, know or have a feel for the Declaration of Independence better than they do for the Constitution. Nothing, as you all know, nothing is more common than to hear "all men are created equal" being attributed to the Constitution, or praised for its role in the Constitution, which in a deep sense perhaps it is, although not in the literal sense, of course. But Americans are better political scientists maybe than they are historians. So even though they're not quite sure where "all men are created equal" is written, they know it's important, and they sense that somehow as the heart, the beating heart of American republicanism. Some confirmation of this comes from the fact that in most periods of intense political change, and in almost every instance of dramatic and enduring political realignments, partisan realignments, the Declaration emerges as a touchstone of the debate. Each side typically wants to claim it as peculiarly its own, to associate the Declaration's political sentiments with itself, or vice versa. At its height, American political history is a running battle over the interpretation of the Declaration of Independence, over its original meaning and its meaning under present circumstances, under new circumstances. The history of its conflicting interpretation is kind of a golden thread running through American politics and American history. One could say something similar, of course, I realize, about the Constitution. But in many cases, and especially I would say the most significant cases, behind the constitutional controversies of the day will be found a battle over the meaning and the bearing of the Declaration of Independence. This is certainly true, for example, if you take some of the most dramatic cases in the last century or so in America, the civil rights cases, I mean Plessy, Brown, Bakke, and the more recent race cases. These are cases certainly about the language of the Constitution, but they are very close to the issue of what equality means in the Declaration of Independence and in American political practice. What is the ground of human equality? What are the limits of human equality? What's the point of human equality? Those are really questions raised by the Declaration more directly even than they are raised by the Constitution, I would say. So what I want to do today is to evaluate a few of these important controversies and even crises in the history of American democracy from the vantage point of the Declaration's involvement. But in the beginning, I want to say briefly a few words about the Declaration itself. The Declaration and its principles certainly don't solve all the problems of American politics, but they sure create a lot of them, maybe even most of them. The document itself is the source and object of ongoing scholarly controversy, which you've been hearing something about in this brief week. And one could point to 4 or 5 different schools of interpretation of the Declaration in our current period in the American Academy and in American politics. I'm only going to briefly characterize it because you've probably heard enough about them already. There's, of course, the famous interpretation which traces the Declaration to John Locke and to the philosophy of John Locke. This is very old. It goes way back. John Quincy Adams, in one of his marvelous public speeches when he was not president, he was already a congressman, I think, by this point, it mentions John Locke and the philosophy of John Locke and in effect points to it as at least a major philosophical source of the Declaration's teaching. This emphasis has been redoubled ever since the Progressive era in the first part of the 20th century, because you have discontented progressive historians like Carl Becker and Louis Hartz, who didn't like the tone of American politics, the egoism of American politics, the capitalism of American politics, and blamed it, in effect, on the inheritance from John Locke and 17th century English politics. Louis Hartz famously called Lockeanism America's massive national cliche, meaning that it touched every part of America and in no way that was interesting. In only ways that were predictable and tiring to hear about. That's sort of the way the progressives looked at this document and its problems. It has never failed to interest Americans a second question about the Declaration, namely its relation to Christianity. And there is a long shelf of books depicting the founders as honest and honorable Christians, and a second shelf depicting them as skeptics and in many cases atheists. And I'm not going to solve this problem, we're not going to solve this problem, but it is a problem, and there's a lot of ammunition on both sides of that particular battlefield. Then there's a third school, the classical Republican school, as it's sometimes called, associated with Gordon Wood, a great 20th century American historian who was just killed, I don't know if you saw this, in an accident in a parking lot in Rhode Island, which is where he lived, and J.G.A. Pocock and others who tried to revive a kind of Roman patriotism as the animating spirit of at least the American Revolution. Most of them, certainly Gordon Wood, used to think at least that Roman spirit, that selflessness, that devotion to the common good was soon replaced by something closer to capitalism and to the ruthless pursuit of money and power for its own sake. So that even though there was a kind of Roman beginning of American republicanism, it did not last very long. And it was succeeded by a much more modern, much more ruthless, self-interestedness. So those are three schools. The fourth school, I will mention even more rapidly, is a school that looks to Britain and to British constitutional development as the essence of America. And this occurs on both the right and the left. Perhaps the most recent figure to take a view like this is the late Harvard political scientist Sam Huntington, who in a book called, his last major book called Who Are We? Good title, and with the question, says that the essence of America is what he calls Anglo-Protestantism. That is, it's British and it's Protestant and it's a combination of different kinds of Protestant with the Anglo influence. And immigrants have made a big difference in America, needless to say, but immigrants are not the same thing as settlers. And according to Huntington, the character of America was determined by its earliest settlers, by the Puritans and by the Anglicans who came to Virginia, and it has stayed close to that early impression made on it, in the 18th century. And then finally, as a fifth and somewhat more recent strain of interpretation, emphasizing what is sometimes called the law of nations. Now this is, you may not even have heard of this, but this is a kind of growing school of interpretation that takes international law, what we might call today international law, as a kind of cutting edge in the self-understanding of America. We are going to be a different kind of country. We're going to be a much more moral international actor. We are going to follow the rules, the laws of international morality, and America, in other words, gave birth to a whole series of ideas which looked forward to the end of imperialism, or the end, at least, of imperial forms of international relations. Instead, international relations would be dominated by peoples, by countries, getting their independence or asserting their station in the world in just the way that the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence suggests. So there's some truth to each of these interpretations. As an appeal to mankind and for foreign recognition and support, the Declaration took, at least in part, took cognizance of the law of nations. The long indictment of George III in the middle of the document accuses the king of being a tyrant, and it calls him a tyrant 3 times in the course of this document, and instances his violations of America's Constitution with a small c in the Declaration of Independence, meaning their own view, the Americans' view of the British Constitution. Things like quartering troops, taxation without representation, these were infractions of a constitutional understanding that we thought we had with Britain. We thought we partook of the British protections in the British Constitution, and it turned out we didn't, and that was the crisis. Milton, John Milton, in his political writings and in Paradise Lost, also makes much of the Christian Republican theme. He takes equality very explicitly as sort of the principle of the genuine Christian republic. So that was something that John Adams was well aware of and really never forgot. So at least as an element in what was going on, that was itself very important. But of course, it's the unalienable rights and the social compact that dominate the Declaration's logic of resistance and revolution and independence. The United States was the first country in human history to be founded so explicitly on the theory of natural rights and the social compact. In many ways, America is still the only country in the world whose national identity and civic purpose rest pretty squarely, at least, on this doctrine. In most countries, citizenship as a formal and still more as an informal or cultural factor depends on shared ethnicity, kinship, language, and religion, not on the free sense of contracting individuals. But the world has moved more and more in the direction of America. And this is perhaps slightly out of date now, since even in the United States there has been a great revival on the right and even to a certain extent on the left in the sense of American identity as an ethnic or even racial category. And you know, there's from your students, you may hear this. Certainly young right-wingers and some young left-wingers talk a lot about identity and feel lost, submerged in a country that they don't see themselves in quite the way that they thought they would. In the language of the Declaration, the social compact is an inference from the principle that all men are created equal. Before the institution of government, men are naturally in a state of equality vis-a-vis one another. No mature human being having any more authority over another than the other has over him. This state of natural equality is therefore also a state of natural liberty, as you have undoubtedly heard this week. From such a condition, political society can arise only by mutual consent in two stages. First, by unanimous consent to form a distinct society or body politic. Second, by majority consent to entrust a particular form of government with authority over that civil society. In a nutshell, that's the Declaration's account of the social compact. But the Declaration doesn't mention the state of nature, nor does it derive men's rights from anterior selfish passions as Thomas Hobbes did, or as John Locke did too, in a slightly different way. If you just read the Declaration of Independence, you might be struck by something different, that it insists on looking at rights as part of a divine and natural endowment, in the light of the high rather than of the low, rather than of the passions of self-preservation and so forth that are the low but supposedly solid basis of the argument for Lockean and Hobbesian social contract theory. Social compact theory, especially in its Hobbesian and Spinozist form, is often taken to be anti-Christian in effect, if not in intention. Often it is said to be anti-Christian in both. The argument is the state of nature replaces the Garden of Eden. Man's beginnings are not glorious. There's no Garden of Eden. They are necessitous. Man's radically on his own, owing little or nothing to God and nature, and so sovereignty in the form of the modern secular state replaces God's grace as the necessary and sufficient condition for human felicity. Heaven yields to heaven on earth. But this is not how the Americans understood their own social contract. John Adams and many other Americans thought social compact theory was necessary to make sense of Protestantism, to save Protestantism from itself. Compact theory enforces, at last, a separation between the kingdom of man, or the kingdom of the world, and the kingdom of God. First, by discovering a new basis for political authority in the consent of the governed, and second, by distinguishing church membership now a voluntary act guided by individual consent from political membership or citizenship. From the American's point of view, if Locke didn't exist, he'd have to be invented, because Locke was necessary to save Luther and Calvin, for that matter, to prevent the genuine spiritual insights of Protestantism, on which point almost all of them were agreed, from succumbing to new forms of ecclesiastical and civil despotism. Social compact theory thus found a ready home among the Puritan divines of New England and the Anglicans and Baptists of the American South. Because far from abolishing Christianity, it actually tended to save it by restoring it to its non-persecuting purity, by making it as close to the original, the genuine religion of Christ and his disciples as possible, by separating church and state enough to be able to disarm them in their contest for authority with each other. For many Americans, including American Catholics, the church in Rome caught up with them about 2 centuries later. Social compact theory allowed the U.S. to enjoy the purest Christianity and healthiest respect for religion that the world had seen in many, many centuries. I emphasize that because it's not an argument one hears very often, but if you could find it in many different sources, even in someone like Tom Paine, but you'll find it in Adams too, and you'll find it even in Madison and some of the Virginians. Okay. The Declaration's compact theory flourished in America when it was understood as the teaching of both God and nature. Now, a word about nature. What was the ground and meaning of man's natural equality that the founders saw? For Spinoza, famous Enlightenment philosopher, man was not, quote, a kingdom within a kingdom. And for Hobbes, man is more distinctive than that, but more isolated, living by nature a solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short existence. The short's a little inconsistent, because if it's so nasty, what's wrong with it being short? There's a little internal tension in that famous phrase. But for Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, Supreme Court Justice, and a great defender of the Constitution in 1787. Both of these gentlemen, Hamilton and Wilson, explicitly attack Hobbes for his alleged materialism and atheism. And many founders, among them such disparate thinkers as John Adams and James Wilson and Thomas Jefferson, part company with Hobbes and to a degree even Locke on the issue of man's sociality and morality. Man is naturally social, they argue, not living in a state of nature. And he's guided by, this is the Scottish Enlightenment influence, man is guided by a natural moral sense, like the senses of, physical senses of touch, sight, smell, and so forth. There's also a moral sense helping us to distinguish right from wrong, which doesn't operate directly, you might say, on reason, but rather through the senses, through the sensorium, through our bodies and how our bodies connect to episodes and things outside of themselves. But if man is born for society and even for benevolence, what's he doing in the state of nature? That's a good question, which it will take me too far maybe to answer. So let me continue by moving forward in American history. As a matter of fact, the Declaration of Independence first enters American politics directly in the debate between the anti-federalists and the federalists over what exactly Republican government and union should mean in America. The anti-federalists, you read some of these writings, I'm sure, in this course. I've seen them listed on the syllabus. So if you haven't read them, something's very wrong in this course. Look at these people. They look innocent, you're a teacher. The Anti-Federalists accused their opponents of betraying the spirit of the Revolution and the Declaration by attempting to consolidate the 13 free and independent states, as the Declaration calls them in its final paragraph, attempting to consolidate the 13 free and independent states under the authority of a greatly centralized and empowered government, which would, they thought, the Anti-Federalists thought, inevitably decline into oligarchy and despotism. The Federalists, the other side of this debate, defending the newly proposed Constitution, countered that it was necessary, its newly centralized or empowered government and so forth was necessary to preserve the one people that the Declaration speaks of in its first paragraph, in its opening paragraph. The Declaration, in other words, says both things, that Americans are one people who have been associated with another people, now are tired of it, but they also say in the end that what's being declared free and independent are the 13 states, the baker's dozen of states, as Wilmer Kendall famously called it, the baker's dozen of states in the American Union, not so much one state or one consolidated state. You may recall that the Declaration itself never mentions democracy or republic or commonwealth. The only regimes, the only forms of government it talks about are monarchy and tyranny in the course of its own argument. Nonetheless, its requirements for the consent of the governed and the respect of equal men's rights does, I think, point to a new liberal form of republicanism or republican government. Both the Federalists and their opponents understood all those arguments, but I would say the Federalists did so more profoundly and inventively. But the characteristic tension between majority will and the restraints on it, visible in that 1787 to 88 debate, lived on under the ratified Constitution. In the Democratic Republic of the United States, there's room for a Democratic Party and a more Republican political party, and for both parties emphasizing, respectively, the states and the Union. Americans were lucky to have settled the party battle over the Constitution before the French Revolution began in earnest, but it began very quickly in the 1790s. So, because the French Revolution was a watershed, really, in the evolution of political doctrines. Its influence on the party disputes of the 1790s is well known, but it continued, and what I want to talk about is how it shadowed American political debate for the rest of the 19th century. The party debates of the 1790s, as everyone always says, were the bitterest political partisan debates probably in American history. More bitter than the debates in our own era between Republicans and Democrats, or between Trumpers and never-Trumpers. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, although it's hard to reckon exactly. The 1850s, on the verge of civil war with the debates in the 1790s. But there was a kind of, there were incipient currents, you might say, that could have led to civil war in the 1790s as the French Revolution, as the waves, the big waves from the French Revolution made their way across the Atlantic and encountered American politics. On the one hand, the French Revolution shaped the conservatism of the Whig Party, the party in which young Abraham Lincoln grew up. The Whigs did not abandon the Declaration's teaching about individual rights, but the Whigs increasingly interpreted the social compact through the lens of Edmund Burke's speeches and writings. Edmund Burke, the sort of the father of philosophical conservatism in his situation in England, enjoyed a tremendous vogue in early 19th century America. And along with Cicero, Burke became a favorite model for Whig oratory. Under his sway, and also influenced by some of the last members of the Federalist Party, the last surviving, the last Federalists and the first Whigs began to, you might say, historicize the compact, the social compact, to locate the idea of the compact in British constitutional development, and also as a legacy of Puritan congregationalism. The understanding of the British Constitution was itself changing. For Americans in 1776, the British common law and natural law overlapped, but they began to move apart in the early decades of the 19th century in favor of the view that was taken from Burke, basically, that slow change in the Constitution was the way that the Constitution participated in nature. This entailed, so to speak, horizontal natural law over time, rather than vertical natural law under God's will or under nature's intent. This sort of horizontal or historical natural law had a great vogue in certain elements, at least, of the Whig Party. Republican government, accordingly, became not so much a choice as a kind of destiny, or even an inheritance that we had to work out somehow in our own situation. Whigs often appealed to Burke. They called the social compact, as he had, a compact in all virtue, in all perfection, and so forth. They shared Burke's impatience with what he memorably called the little catechism of the rights of man. You can find, many, not so much Quincy Adams, but certainly you can find a lot of Whigs who take that view, Daniel Webster being one of them, other New England Whigs in particular. Alarmed by the movement for universal manhood suffrage that raced through a new series of state constitutional conventions in the 1820s and 1830s, the Whigs denounced a Jacobinical, that is like in the French Revolution, the radicals in the French Revolution, a threat to property and law. As one pre-Whig conservative said in the Virginia Convention, if we accept manhood suffrage, now what's next? Women's suffrage? Or other horrors like that. The arguments for suffrage extension began from all men are created equal, typically, in the Jacksonian democratic tradition at the early part of the 19th century. The opponents objected that natural rights did not overrule prudence, and that universal suffrage would pose a danger to property and its protection, which was one of the natural rights, after all. So property needs the protection that the other natural rights have as well. And so there was a kind of resistance on the part of Whigs to these new democratizing currents in the Jacksonian Democratic Party. The great Whig theme was the obligatoriness of law. Think of Lincoln's Lyceum address, that law is binding, morally binding, and that you enter in a social contract and you're supposed to keep that contract. You've pledged to obey the law, to restrain yourself, to protect the rights of others as well as your own rights. If you don't do that, no form of law can endure. No form of Republican government can endure. That was, you might say, the Whig argument. Which is why, looking at the arch enemy of the Whigs, looking at Andrew Jackson, he seemed to be a kind of Bonaparte or a kind of Caesar. And because of their fear of an American Bonaparte, they looked to Burke who had warned against the French Revolution and the developments of the French Revolution as a kind of prescient note, and because of their fear of a Caesar, you know, a general, a successful general, becoming a huge, you know, demotic politician, they looked to Cicero as well as a kind of counter to the new, the new Caesar that arguably Andrew Jackson might have represented. Now, I've been talking about the Whigs, now I want to say something a little bit more about the Democrats and the Southerners in America in the 19th century. In the South, the reaction to the French Revolution was more radical and more racially based than in the North. The North and South both had learned in the French Revolution that individual rights and the social compact could shatter a society, could destroy a great ancient existing society which looked very firm and steady, but in fact wasn't. The Whigs counseled patience and education. The nation must be prepared for liberty with law. Among Southern Democrats, the more radical thought was that the individualism and the universalism of natural rights had to be overcome once and for all. Rights, the Democrats in the South argued, rights should belong to groups, to the constituent parts of society, and especially to the dominant parts that have proved their dominance through trial and struggle, through historical perseverance. You can see why, from this material, the first really public argument in defense of slavery, an argument and assertion of the positive good of black slavery should emerge from these elements, you might say, imported to some extent from the French into the bloodstream of American politics. So John C. Calhoun, you know, the famous senator vice president from South Carolina, he eventually rejects the Declaration of Independence on these grounds. When Jefferson wrote, Calhoun said that all men are created equal, he was wrong. Calhoun called this the most false and dangerous of all political errors, to think that all men are created equal. So this is something really new in American politics. The undisguised rejection and contempt for the basic doctrines, the premises of the argument in the Declaration of Independence. The vice president of the Confederacy, an old friend of Abraham Lincoln, a man named Alexander Stephens, echoed Calhoun's argument. The authors of the Declaration, Stephens said, had sincerely believed in human equality, but they were wrong. That was the best science of the 18th century, but unfortunately it had already been disproved. And this is before Darwin. You know, Darwin doesn't write the Origin of Species doesn't stop published until 1859, right on the verge of the Civil War, right after the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But already these evolutionary notions that human nature is not fixed, it's not equal, certainly, but it's involved in a contest for survival, contest for domination and reproduction. All these thoughts were already loose in American politics by the end of the 1850s. Trying to hold the Union together, Stephen Douglas of Illinois argued that the Declaration was still defensible, so he's taking, in some respects, a more conservative position than his fellow Democrats. But it's still defensible because all men meant all white men are created equal. That's all it meant, all it ever meant, according to Stephen Douglas. And of course, Chief Justice Roger Taney in Dred Scott would agree with that. That's the original intent of the founders, was simply white rights. white men's rights. This again was a radical depreciation of the Declaration, a radical rejection of what had been understood as the Declaration's document, but widespread and deeply rooted by the coming of the Civil War. Consistent with this radical conventionalization and historicization of politics, a whole new social science emerged in the South, best represented by George Fitzhugh, one of Lincoln's favorite writers, strangely enough, who in two books, one called A Sociology for the South, and the other called, a more amusing book called Cannibals All. Well, Cannibals All is in print. I'm not sure that the other one is still in print, but it should be, because it is important. But Fitzhugh developed a comparative sociology of free and slave societies, drawing upon Aristotle to oppose Locke on this question of the natural freedom and equality of human beings. This was, I would say, a perversion of Aristotle, but it's a reminder, that it's better to have Aristotle with you than against you. And that the social compact doctrine is strongest and most reasonable when, as the founders did, one starts from a kind of common sense agreement. These are four names that come out of a famous letter from Jefferson. A common sense agreement of Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney, two ancients, two moderns, one Greek, one Roman, two Englishmen, as explaining the common sense of the Declaration of Independence as Jefferson saw it. Okay, I'm not going to go on forever, you'll be glad to hear, but I'm coming to an end. Though defeated on the battlefield, the South rose again intellectually after the Civil War, as newly professionalized sciences of politics and economics began to appear in the United States and at the best universities in the nation. Heavily influenced by social Darwinism, which follows quickly after Darwinism, and the German science of the state. In the beginning, to get a PhD in America, you mostly had to go to Germany. You couldn't get a PhD at Harvard, couldn't get a PhD at Yale. They were still colleges. They were going to turn into research universities soon and begin granting lots of PhDs, but they didn't really do it until the 1880s, 1870s, early 1880s, more like it. But influenced by both social Darwinism and the German science of the state, the new sciences had more in common with antebellum Southern researchers than with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. For example, here's probably the best professor at Yale and the most famous sociologist in the United States, almost without question, William Graham Sumner, who's a very good writer, and he has a reputation these days as kind of libertarian, but he's a very odd libertarian. This is what he said about natural rights. Quote, "Before the tribunal of nature, a man has no more right to life than a rattlesnake. He has no more right to liberty than any wild beast. His right to the pursuit of happiness is nothing but a license to maintain the struggle for existence, if he can find within himself the powers with which to do it." So that is where the Declaration of Independence is in the Yale classroom, you might say, by the 1880s and 1890s, at the end of this century. Or to take another famous professor, not at Yale, but at Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. You probably already heard something about Wilson in this class, but if not, now you have. He wrote a textbook when he was a young professor, for the same reason most young professors write textbooks, because they need the money. So he wrote a book called, rather ominously, The State, Elements of Historical and Practical Politics. Historical and practical, not theoretical. That's the important thing. That's the point. And he said this about social compact theory in his textbook. He said, the defects of the social compact theory are too plain to need more than brief mention. That theory simply has no historical foundation. No historical foundation. It's a fantasy. It's a superstition. Status was the basis of primitive society. The individual counted for nothing. Government came, so to say, before the individual. Government in the sense of family, clan, all the various levels of social authority pre-existed the discovery of the individual by thousands of years. That's his point. He's not against individuals, but he thinks individuals are not natural. Individuals are a cultural and historical artifact. You've got to have modern civilization. You've got to have the Renaissance. You've got to have the Reformation before you can have an individual. And so what the Declaration is talking about, equal individuals with rights coming from nature, is, from Woodrow Wilson's point of view, a ridiculous fantasy. It's a worst of 18th century, so-called science, completely disproven by 19th century political, sociological, anthropological, ethnographic, and other kinds of science. There's consequently no place for contract, because individuals are already in society. They're already all of the free places for contracting are filled with your relatives, your clan members, the people who have authority, different kinds of authority over you. Wilson therefore threw overboard what he called the literary theory of the Constitution and the Declaration, rejecting it as hopelessly 18th century. Instead, he posited the theory of the living Constitution. This is his term. Other people have used the same term in this period. And we still talk about the living Constitution today, mostly as a question in judicial appointments, of whether justices that are being nominated to the Supreme Court believe in original intent or believe in the living Constitution. Well, this is a very old idea on the left side of American politics, going back to the very beginning, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The idea is that, this is applying Darwin to the law, applying Darwin to politics. All that changes as a result of slow, gradual adaptation to new circumstances. Evolution, not revolution. That's the thing about the left in America, is it really has never been revolution. To the extent it is one or the other, it has been, from the 19th century, late 19th century on, an evolutionary doctrine. The left has been interested in building the modern state, not overthrowing the modern state. They're not Marxists. They're sort of Hegelians, you could say. They come from they're not unrelated to Marx, but they're from a different wing of that movement. This was kind of the revenge of the British Empire upon America, that some kind of slow, gradual cultural change is the only way to go in politics. No revolutions. There's no right of revolution in modern 20th century American liberalism. You don't have a chance, you don't have the right to leave the state. You don't have a right to remake your country unless you do it under academic supervision and slowly, by obeying tenure and other natural laws. But the eclipse of the Declaration of Independence, such as under William Graham Sumner and Wilson, did not last long. As a political movement, progressivism, you could say, was dead by 1920. Wilson had bungled the peace after World War I, and his idealism, his belief in progress, seemed discredited by the tragedy of the war. His idealistic break with America's past and his abandonment of the Declaration and its language came to seem excessive too. it was FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took up Wilson's mantle and succeeded at last in making the Democratic Party a permanently progressive party. I mean, if you put yourself back at the turn of the century, the 20th century, it's amazing what Wilson set out to do and what he and his sort of adjutant, FDR, accomplished. At that point, after the Civil War, the Democratic Party is the most reactionary, the most prejudiced, the most racist, the most secessionist, the most backward-looking party in American politics. But Wilson conceived the idea, and FDR executed the idea, to take this rump party and turn it into the progressive party, the most forward-looking, the most aspirational, the most idealistic, the most future-oriented party in American politics. And it worked. I mean, they were able to make this amazing change in the course of the first couple of decades of the last century. It was Roosevelt, FDR, who saw how to do it by learning a new language of rights, which he spoke very fluently, and which sounded much closer to the founding, much closer to the historic American traditions than Wilson had. In his Commonwealth Club address in 1932, his most philosophical address probably that he ever gave, FDR, Commonwealth Club's in San Francisco, still there. You can go and hear a speech if you wish. He said in that speech that government is a contract by which the people consent to large power in certain rulers on consideration that they, the people, be accorded certain rights. The task of statesmanship has always been the redefinition of these rights, he said, in terms of a changing and growing social order. Or to put it more abstractly, new conditions impose new requirements upon government and those who conduct government. Now, this is an odd reading of the old Declaration of Independence. Not only does the contract among the people to set up a government come off as a contract between the people and their rulers, a la Magna Carta. I mean, it's really a medieval contract, not a modern individualist contract at all. But the terms of the agreement, far from resting on permanent and inalienable rights, are offered up as negotiable and infinitely renegotiable. The Declaration admits that prudence indeed will dictate concerning the application of individual rights in concrete political situations, but it hardly suggests that these rights are in need of redefinition all the time to keep up with social changes. Roosevelt says that the terms of the new social contract he calls for are as old as the Republic and as new as the new economic order. And these are what those rights are about. Every man, he says, has a right to life. And this means that he also has a right to make a comfortable living. These rights, in other words, have to be living rights. They have to be redefined according to new circumstances. It's not by any means a crazy argument, but it's a bold redefinition, and it's opening a whole new chapter in the interpretation of rights in American history. Every man, he says, has a right to his own property, which means a right to be assured in the safety of his savings. So these rights, the old rights, are given a very new with it kind of meaning, and never more so than in the so-called Second Bill of Rights. This was in 1944, a very old and sick FDR by this time. You can't physically deliver his State of the Union address, so he sends it over to be read. But in this address is one of the most famous passages of any modern American political speech. He says that we need to increase and to redefine rights. For example, the right to a useful and remunerative job, to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing, the right of every family to a decent home, to adequate medical care. I mean, we're still fighting many of these fights. Many of them, of course, are already won. The right to protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education, not just an education, but a good education. The ground of this easy alchemy of turning desires and desirable things into rights is the assumption that the struggle for existence has been won, that we don't have a scarcity of resources anymore. This is part of the most amazing thing he claims. Right at the end of the Depression, of tremendous economic poverty and suffering in America, he says, our industrial plant is finished. We don't need more factories. We don't need more products. We don't need new kinds of businesses or industries. We have enough to spare and enough to go around. All we need to do is redistribute so that everyone can enjoy the plenty that our technology and our economy can produce. And when that happens, then the basic needs of every self will be met. And the self can turn its attention from production and from economics in general to satisfaction and to having a good life, having a happy life. That's sort of where Roosevelt leaves us at the end of his life and at the end of his political career. Let me conclude by saying this is, I think, still more or less where we are today in our politics. If you take Barack Obama as a kind of new Roosevelt, or you may have forgotten that, but he was put on the cover of Time magazine dressed as Franklin Roosevelt with a bowler, a cigarette holder, and in a sort of 1930s car. And the headline of the Time magazine was "The New Deal," and that really was an important part of the Obama appeal. And of course, it's also true that his vice president, later his successor, Joe Biden, Roosevelt was his favorite president, basically, and he could still remember him, or claim to. And so he, all the major themes of the Biden administration, not the Biden administration, sorry, the Biden administration, were Rooseveltian. Build back better. That's a kind of Rooseveltian sentiment and slogan. But the times are different, and the intellectual, what's in circulation intellectually, is also very different. Postmodern liberals, of whom Obama, I think, is one, embrace a certain kind of loose talk about truth and moral and political truth. It's not exactly possible for them to speak truth to power, because all truth is itself a version of power or will to power, a mode of discourse. Even as good-hearted a liberal today as Barack Obama found himself torn between his belief in justice, his belief in progress, and his belief, as he said in The Audacity of Hope, that there is no absolute truth. Well, if there's no absolute truth, there really is no truth. And so you have a problem, maybe you have an explanation to give us at any rate. But we're in a situation where all men are created equal has come to mean something quite different from what it did to the founders or even to most 19th century Americans. There's a big difference between knowing the truth, being able to know the truth, to understand a self-evident truth, truth, and I assume you've spent some time talking about what a self-evident truth is and how we might be able to understand it, and believing that there is no absolute truth. And so it's futile to pursue it, much less to think you or imagine that you possess it. As Lincoln said at Philadelphia, he thought, at least, there was something in the Declaration giving liberty not only to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. This, Lincoln said, is the sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. That's the sentiment that he believed in. And he said he'd learned it from the Declaration. That's where he got it. Our position today, I think, is perilous in the sense that we really don't know what we think the Declaration means, or what a self-evident truth would be if we could find one. But you only spent a week thinking about these questions. It will take longer than that to figure them out for sure, but I'm glad to see you all. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to perhaps future interviews with you in future seminars if you can sustain them. All right, thank you very much.
We've got time for about one or two questions, I'm afraid, is all.
Okay.
Who's got
I'll give you quick answers.
If Obama was the new FDR, what's Trump?
Well, an easy but wrong answer would be that he is something from the old regime. He's Herbert Hoover, or although he couldn't be more different as a human type, he's a Coolidge of some kind from the old regime that the new Obama regime, or the New Deal, has discredited as outdated and impossible to believe under contemporary circumstances. But in fact, that isn't what Trump is. Trump is something different. I mean, Trump is the thing about Trump is, this is the beginning, I'm afraid, of a long conversation, but I'll make it short. The thing about Trump is that it's amazing what he has, not only what he has done, but what he's tried to do. I mean, he's talked about, he's accomplished some things which the conservative movement in the country has been talking about doing. But Trump has done them, in some cases, in 6 months or the first part of his second term. And the conservative movement has been talking about them for 60 years. And how was he able to do that? I mean, that's what we don't exactly know. There are a lot of questions about Trump. But it's clear to me that he resembles Andrew Jackson more than perhaps any other president so far in our history, and that we're so busy deploring him or celebrating him that we haven't really taken the chance to understand him, as he understands himself, and that's very difficult to do, because it's not clear he understands himself. But on the assumption that he does, what is it he understands himself to be doing? And he never, he's often called a populist. As far as I can tell, he's never used the term. He never calls himself a populist. He calls himself a nationalist when he calls himself anything at all. He was never, and is not now, a member of the conservative movement in the country. He was never a movement conservative. He has always been what he called, and this is his term, a common sense conservative. He's not really wedded to the conservative movement of Bill Buckley or even Ronald Reagan. He's quite liberated from a lot of that. But I have consistently argued that much of his program is very old-fashioned. I mean, tariffs. Look, the Republican Party was the party of high tariffs, from Abraham Lincoln to Herbert Hoover. I mean, for generations, high tariffs was Republican policy. An activist but conservative judiciary, that was Republican Party when they could get it as well. And a restrained foreign policy, but still a self-confident and not a shrinking violet by any means. That too is sort of part of the Teddy Roosevelt tradition of American Republican foreign policy. So in many respects, even though he seems to be the most untraditional politician you could imagine, he is moving in fairly well-run, well-worn grooves of old-fashioned Republican, post-Lincoln, post-McKinley politics. You could understand a lot more about his platform by looking at their platforms, in certain respects at least, than you would imagine. There's a lot that he has named after himself, but in fact comes from much older and different and frankly more respectable sources than you might imagine, or that he imagined.
That was one big question, so I think we're going to. Okay, thank you very much, Joel. Thank you. All right, so thank you again to Mr. Kesler.